All right, this lecture is on parent-child interactions. So we're going to start by talking about conversations. There will be some videos that I can't show in this lecture set simply because YouTube will flag it and not approve it. So they'll be linked on Canvas so you can see them. Um, so for the most part, this will be text, but please check out the videos. They're very interesting and they show some good examples of what we're trying to actually convey here. So we'll start with conversations and then go into different genres of talk like politeness, negotiation, storytelling, and so on. So first, we're going to talk about how parents talk to their children. Research in the old days focused mostly on mothers, but nowadays we know that there's not really that much of a difference between parents, especially as things have changed in society. And then taking a look at how errors and corrections work in conversations and whether kids respond to them nicely or not. So first of all, let's take a look at parentese, and this is also called infant-directed speech. So I will write this out: infant-directed speech, or IDS, called motherese in the old days, parentese after that. Um, so what are the different properties of this? So I think you know a lot of this intuitively just based on what you heard people do, since a lot of, especially in Canada and the United States, it's very similar. So you get these pauses between words. It's very high pitched, very exaggerated, and it's very slow. So that's the general cadence of the voice. As far as vocabulary goes, parents typically aren't talking to kids like they're college students. The vocabulary is small. They're saying things in different ways. And of course, they're talking about things closer to them. What's interesting about parentese is that even though the vocabulary is small and the pronunciation is very exaggerated, the sentences are actually pretty good. So they're short, but in terms of how many correct sentences they produce, they tend to produce correct sentences more around babies than with other adults. So a lot of times when adults speak to each other, they might omit certain things or make a lot of fragments because it's just what the conversation needs. But with children and babies, when they're doing this parentese talk, it it tends to be better. The subject is there, the object is there, the verb is there. Like these are complete sentences. We also get a lot more commands and questions, so it's a lot more response from the baby. Okay, so does this help? That's a great question. Parents seem to do it, but does it actually help development? So the answer for this is possibly. Um, Recent research has shown that actually, with parentese, children seem to be better at turn taking at like a younger age, so it develops a little bit faster. But the general consensus for this is that it is helpful but not necessary. So there was a study done in this town called Tracton in the 1970s. So this is an was reported as a working class African American community. So um, these parents treated children quite differently and atypically compared to what you would expect from a general group of people anywhere in the United States or Canada. So these specific adults did not simplify their words. They didn't do any of this parentese talk, and they also didn't see children as conversational partners. So, in other words, like they weren't having conversations with them or asking them these questions a lot. It was mainly just like talking to another adult um, in terms of like commands. So, warnings, things not to do, teasing them. So, what do we see here? Well, even though these parents talk to children these ways, we did not see delays from these children. So, in other words, they acquired language at a very typical pace, even though they didn't get this parentese help. So, although parentese seems to be this very common thing that parents intuitively do in certain cultures, it's not necessary to help development. It's basically just this cute, slow voice that you'd say to babies or dogs that can help in some aspects, like turn taking or maybe acquiring more advanced vocabulary a little bit earlier, but you don't need it. Okay. So then what other things can help? Well, the question is, okay, we have conversations with kids a lot. So is a child tending to learn language by imitating adults? Okay. So, I mean, this is an interesting question because, I mean, conversation is important, regardless of whether there's parentees or not. Um, Children could technically learn language just by imitating what they hear. It's like a response system. Okay. So, the general consensus for this is no. And there's a few reasons for this. So, one of the reasons is that we have this thing that we heard about very early on called productivity, where you can produce new sentences you've never heard or seen before. So the understanding here is that you can't imitate complete sentences. I mean, you can, but what you're really imitating are words or phrases. These are small chunks that you would imitate over and over again, and you'd eventually learn by combining those imitated small words and phrases into bigger sentences to convey what you mean. Just with productivity alone, imitation is not solely responsible. Okay, so another interesting thing here is that imitation is limited by grammar. And what do I mean by that? That means the child's grammar. So let's say children are at this telegraphic stage where they're doing these very short, two simple sentences, and someone says, um, like, you are wearing a blue shirt. And what is the child going to respond with? Wear shirt. Like, even when they try to imitate, they're still being limited by the grammar that they have internally. So it it's not just hearing an input and then trying to repeat that input. They're still processing that sentence and then they're trying to produce something that they can produce in their own grammar. So they have the idea in their mind and then they say it back. So this is not just simple like imitation. Okay. And then the biggest piece of evidence against this is that, children barely even do this. Like it happens at a younger age with a lot of single words when they're trying to learn it or express it, but the full imitation is not happening frequently enough at all. Okay, so here's a sample conversation, and we can kind of see what we mean here. So, do you know what this is? What this is? Car? You see any of the hashtags there, the pound signs? These are pauses. No, that's not a car. Pin, pin. Yeah, mummy, pin. Okay, so it's a pen. It is a pen. That's what we're getting at here. The mother is responding with this question. Okay, what kind of pen? Car pen. What kind of car? Red car, yellow car. What do you do with it? Watch. Where horses go? Where what go? Where horses go? Horse? Horse. Go, yes, mommy. Did he go to the corral? Did he? There he is. Corral, corral, baby horses, horses. Okay. If we take a look at this and we ask ourselves, who is doing the imitation in this typical conversation? It is not the kid, it is the mother. Okay. Um, so I mean, this is just one conversation out of many, but this is typical imitation. Like they're just not doing it. They're going off on their own conversation. They're starting their own thing, and maybe the parent is the one doing imitation as like a question to prompt, or they're doing imitation with some corrections, which we'll basically take a look at that in a bit. It's called recasting. But first, let's take a look at corrections, like explicit corrections. So here's a conversation. Nobody don't like me. Then the mother says, no, say nobody likes me. And the child, what do they respond with? Nobody don't like me. And they do it 8 times. Okay, so the mother goes into more detail. No, listen carefully. Say, nobody likes me. The child says, okay, in my moment of genius, I got this. And nobody don't likes me. So that's one example. The other one spoon example is quite classic in first language acquisition. So child's trying to say other one spoon. They're trying to say you want the other spoon. And this is very typical of what you'd see here. So can you say the other spoon? And then they go one by one. Other one spoon. Okay. Father, say other spoon, spoon, other spoon. Child got it. Now give me other one spoon. So like in terms of their mental grammar, they're just doing what they believe is correct. It's like they're trying to do imitation here. It's just not working, and the corrections don't seem to be working well at all. Okay, so the reality is that parents aren't actually correcting their children explicitly all that often. Maybe sometimes, but if you think about like, let's give a ballpark of 200 words a day. Let's say they're younger, they're just learning language. 200 words a day that are audible and coherent. Okay, maybe they're correcting one or two of those. So it's not that often, and children just aren't responding to them in general. They're just producing what they can produce internally, what they think is correct. Okay. What about recasting? This is like combining the best of both worlds. It's like some imitation and repetition from the adult, but also they're like just implicitly correcting it. Like they're not saying it explicitly. They're not trying to explicitly correct the child. They're just repeating the phrase, but with the correct phrasing. Okay. So some examples would be like if Eve, a child, says, I don't read no books, the parent, the mother might respond is, I know you're not going to read any books. So it's a very normal sentence response, but there's just a correction there. So have two cracker. How many crackers? With the S. Up wall. On the wall, yeah. Another one. What I do to it? Oh, what did you do to it? It's you're just responding in the typical adult way. Okay. So does this work? Well, let's take a look at a conversation first, and then just one anecdote out of here, but we can still see how a typical conversation goes. Okay, I got a pant on. You've got what on? Shoes on. Pant on too. Shirt on too. Shoes on, pants on, shirt on. Yeah, what else? Shoelace, pant, shoes, shoelace. Okay. So it's just a typical conversation. There's no explicit correction here. The mother is just responding with the correct word. Let's keep going. Okay, mummy has a sock on. No, I haven't socks on. Okay, so you can tell at this point it's it's a British conversation because we would not say this, but I haven't socks on. I don't have socks on. Okay, some more explicit, so some more conversation with some recast. Ursula has boots on, have shoes on, eyes, how many eyes? Four eyes, how many ears? How many nose? Yes, how many noses? Okay, so this is just a typical conversation with recasting. So does this work? Well, first of all, the rates of recasting are actually very low. So if you take a look at these stats here from an older study, if you take a look at the bad sentences, only 26% of them are even recasted. Okay, so if recasting is effective, it should probably be done a little bit more often. And if you take a look at the good sentences, well, it's only 13.7% of the sentences that are good that are like repeated or recasted. It's kind of hard to say there's a correction and a recast when it's a good sentence, but just like repeated back with the question. Okay. And some of the times too, parents, when they say something back, they just repeat the error too, because they're like trying to talk with the kid at their level. So book, read book. All right, you read book. Yeah. Or you read book if you want to think of it in past tense. But in other words, we need an auxiliary there. Okay. So first of all, they're not always recasting with explicit good corrections. And also the bad sentences are only recasted like less than twice the amount of times as the good sentences. So there's just not enough information here for a child to know when a recast is like useful information. Especially if they're only recasting the bad sentences like less than twice as much as the good sentences, because like a recast should symbolize in a lot of forms like, hey, this is time for like some I'm going to showcase what a good example is. But it's hard with this information for a child to distinguish, like, are they just repeating something good that I said, or are they fixing something bad? Especially when parents are doing this confusing thing where they're repeating the errors back. So recasting is just like not reliable for a typical person. But does it help? And to do this, you need to go beyond just a typical case between parent and child. You need to actually do a study and train parents to see if recasting is actually going to work. Okay, so there's a study done with this, and uh, the thing that we've seen before is they only provide recasts a certain amount of times. It's not that great, and the older studies were like, it doesn't help. Okay. So this was just like with typical conversations, no intervention. But what if you did this study over a longer period of time and you trained parents explicitly to recast as much as possible? So to not recast the good utterances, just the bad utterances, and to do it at a much higher rate. So this takes a lot of time. It can be difficult and challenging for the parent. But when you do this and you train parents and you make sure it's consistent and you do it over a long time, recasting tends to lead to an improvement over that time, and a significant improvement, like a 100% success rate for what we're recasting. We are seeing improvements. If you don't recast, then in terms of like these pre and post test studies, only 40% of the children are passing these. So on the metrics that they're using in order to test whether or not recasting is helping or not, parents who recasted with the training got children who were always successful in their pre and post tests. Well, if you don't recast, it doesn't. So at least there's some evidence here that if you do recasting very consistently, you know how to do it and you're not repeating these bad utterances. So you're not repeating in grammatically incorrect utterances from the child in the same way they're doing it, and you're not repeating so many good utterances. So in other words, the proportion is very different. Uh, it can help development. Okay. So, in terms of these conversations to help children acquire language, imitation, corrections, and recasting, there's not a lot of evidence that any of these really help individually, especially just with natural parentees. But if you can get trained in recasting and are very consistent with it, you can see some benefits there. Okay. One more thing here, which is a little bit different, is hypercorrection. So, it's another speech error that we see. It's a different type of speech error, and there wasn't really a nice place to put them in before because hypercorrection comes from conversations and understanding of other people. But this happens with adults and with kids. Is when they use a form that they believe is correct for a given circumstance. You need some knowledge of language and its speakers to do this. So um, these are typical errors that you'd see from teenagers, children, adults trying to sound correct when they don't understand the rules. So the dog whom bit me, this would be wrong. It should be who, because the dog is the subject of this little clause here. So we should use the subject form. The dog bit Kayla and myself, or the dog bit Kayla and I. These are incorrect as well because these should both be me, because these are objects. If they were a subject, you'd use I, and myself just does not work there because a reflexive should refer to something previous in the sentence. So I bit Kayla and myself would be fine, but not the dog. The dog is not I. Okay, so here's some other examples. This was from one child. It was a case study. They had a parent who was very, what's the word term? Not well off, but they had a pretty respected role. But they spoke in a way that was like non-typical for someone of that role. But what the child did was they thought, okay, this is how somebody professional respected talks. So ones have three spots. This one's does. That bird's does. Okay, so they're, in other words, they're adding these possessive markers to words that should not have them because that's how they've interpreted like formal professional language. Okay, so to understand hypercorrection is to understand that this is not a mistake from the child in terms of their grammar. So they're not overgeneralizing here. What they are doing is they're taking something they believe is correct based on the social characteristics of the speaker, and they're trying to incorporate it into their language. So they're trying to sound correct intentionally. So this is just not, this is like this. Don't think of this as like overgeneralization errors. This is not cognitive limitations. This is an intentional mistake on the child. Okay, so why does this happen? Well, first of all, this only starts happening after like 4 years of age because you need metalinguistic awareness. So you need to understand that, okay, language is just this thing I can use, and there's these different social components to them. So there's this formality, there's slang, there's politeness, there's correctness, there's status, and so on. So when they're doing this hypercorrection, sometimes it's just learning errors. So uh, when we think of the examples like with whom and with someone and I in the object position, you're getting like this partial information. You're saying, okay, I'm being corrected a lot in the subject position or with these object relatives. Therefore, this must just be a general rule that should be used everywhere. So this is how to properly say it. Therefore, what I'm going to do is when I want to sound correct and I pretend to care about this stuff, I will use those in all the right places. And you can remember probably back to like high school, if you did any writing in English where you did the and I rule, and you thought, okay, in English, I always just need to say and I instead of and me. So in normal conversation, you're saying and me, but to your high school teacher, you're being performative and putting and I there. Okay, it turns out it's a lot more nuanced than just and I for English teachers and me in conversations. Some of it comes from linguistic insecurity. So just you're not okay with your own status, your own perception. So you may change things. It might come in a sense from overgeneralizing other rules. But we have to remember overgeneralizing is unintentional. This is acquisition. You're limited by your brain, while hypercorrection is intentional. Okay, so put a question mark there because maybe there's some spillover, maybe there's some overlap, but the intention is a pretty big part of it. The other one is these social associations. So there were studies done with children around 6 years old, and they were able to look at different people who spoke in different ways in different contexts, so different backgrounds, different skin colors, genders, and so on. And children were starting to be able to understand which speech properties, so like whether or not these are formal words, informal words, slang, so on, whether or not um, certain aspects of people, certain types of people, certain properties of people bled into those word types, those linguistic features. So, just as an example, they might have noticed, it's just hypothetical, that three people wearing cowboy hats tend to say ain't more than others, and that just becomes like a property of that of that social identity. Okay. So hypercorrection is interesting, but it happens around the same age that we could still study adults with hypercorrection. So is there anything very specific to children that adults don't do with hypercorrection? Not really. Adults are just a little bit more aware, and they tend to correct errors or understand them a little bit faster, so that way the hypercorrection doesn't extend or happen all that often. I mean, your mileage may vary depending on the adult, but as university students, you may actually still notice it with certain people, um, trying to sound different, but there could be other things going on than just simple hypercorrection. So, okay, that's it for some uh, errors in learning. Let's talk about different talk genres. So this is fun. I like this one. So we're talking about politeness, persuasion, and storytelling. So, what is politeness? We all know what politeness is. It's talking to someone in a way that is kind and favorable according to language conventions. Okay. So, how do children like what do they need to know to be polite? Well, first of all, they need to know the language part. So, what does politeness sound like? They need to understand pragmatics. So, when we make requests, uh, how do we make requests to people who are peers? How do we make requests to people who are above us? And somewhat debatable, an understanding of keeping face with others. So some cultures are really into keeping face more than others. What this basically means is that you need to make yourself look like competent, kind, um, polite, like morally established. You need to basically look good for somebody else, whether you know them or not. So let's look at a conversation in Spanish, or sorry, not Spanish, in Italian. I like that one word. I not look at the whole sentence. So, Italian. So a child from 2 years old, and then a child at about 3 years old. So some different phrases from children over the ages. Okay, so what do we see here in terms of them trying to make requests? So I want wine because I'm thirsty. I want to try a little bit myself. I wanted to attach the tow truck. I wanted to see if the bar was open. So until about 4 years old, we see a lot of questions, imperatives, so things, well, sorry, not really imperatives in these examples or questions in these examples, but you tend to see questions and imperatives. But you also see a lot of like self-centered language. I want to try a little bit myself. I want wine because I'm thirsty. It's like, what do I want? And then here's my explanation. And it's very self-centered because I'm thirsty. Um, what was it? I want to go get me some gum because I'm hungry. Okay, so four, they can use questions and commands, but they don't really have this understanding of politeness yet. So what happens after four? Well, until about 6 years old, so these are two conversations here. Pretty please, cookie, pretty please, I'm going to get out. I am less. You give me some juice, pretty please. Okay, so they're still making requests. They kind of know some of the words in order to make it sound polite, but they don't really get it yet. Like they're not good at it. It's like, okay, pretty please, this isn't polite. It sounds polite, but this is just kind of begging at this point. And then pretty please with a threat. So threats typically aren't polite, but like they're trying at this point. So this is up until 6 years old, and then around seven plus, um, they tend to be able to manipulate their language so that way they can actually act polite. So I don't know what to do on the stupid thing. Can you help me? I don't know how to do that because I didn't get that one done. This one, did you get this? Yeah, I got that. Well then, okay. So it's just like a normal conversation. Um, can you help me? This is a peer, so this is totally fine. Um, Stephanie says, well, I don't know how to do that one. They didn't get that one done. So Lisa then goes on to a different question. And it's not like, well, I don't care that you don't know how to do it, like help me. Like there's an understanding there of being polite and going on to something that's, mutually beneficial. So, about 7 years old, that's when things start to improve. So politeness is going to vary among languages too. So uh, as well as with the principle of cooperation and the pragmatic conditions, crisis maxims, there's also politeness maxims. But there's a lot of different cultural variation depending on how politeness is used. So some of these just happen to do with the words themselves. So in some languages like Japanese, Vietnamese, um, many languages, there's just some typical examples that you would see in textbooks as examples of these. Um, Different family members and different relations have certain terms of address, especially in Vietnamese, like older brothers, older sisters, aunts, uncles. Like you need to know the age of the person you're speaking to. It's very important for politeness and respect. So one of the conversations you might have very early on is like, "How old are you?" Which in in Canada and the United States, it's typically not the first question you'd ask, but in like Vietnamese culture, it'd be a little bit more important. So um, they need to learn certain terms that say English speaking kids don't need to learn. Maybe like sir and ma'am if you're like old school 1960s, but it's much more detailed in Vietnamese. Okay. Uh, Depending on the different culture community you're in, you might have to learn the difference between male and female speech. I don't know if these things are changing over time. There's not a lot of, I mean, there are studies out there, but I'm not too tuned into the sociolinguistic space. So maybe there's some change here. But in societies where gender roles are very split, of course, things are going to be a little bit different. Depending on uh, where you're born and the different types of ways that you can make requests. We see Norwegian and Hungarian. We see two different styles here, where the Norwegian culture typically hints at things rather than makes direct requests, so they're more indirect. The Hungarian, they're more direct than indirect. So depending on where you come from, the way that you learn to make requests and ask for things can be different as well. So in order to be polite, you need to do it in a certain way. Okay, so that's politeness. There's a lot of variation. This is something that just doesn't come in until around 7 years old. Okay, persuasion is fun. So how do children persuade adults to get what they want? So why do children need to persuade adults? Because they want something, they want to do something. Very straightforward. You want something as a person, you need to persuade another person to go along with it. So Weiss and Sachs, 1991, they did this experiment for 3 to 6 years old where like they're putting children in a toy shop, and basically they're saying like at some point the child's going to want something. We're going to see how the child persuades you to get the toy. And parents were given different instructions on how to reject the child. In other words, they're seeing like, okay, what if I just say no? What happens? What if I say it's because we're too poor? What if I blame the child? What if I talk about the toy having an issue? Or what if I say it's like more like conversational? I'm just annoyed at the fact that you keep doing it again. So different reasons. Okay. So here's a conversation. Well, two conversations where we're omitting the asking for it, but we're taking a look at the responses. So, it doesn't look like a very good toy. I bet it'll get broken fast. And the child responds with, no, it won't because his feet are glued, because his feet are glued onto here. So that's how a 3-year-old is negotiating here. So B, I don't like it when you keep asking me over and over again. And the child says, I know that, but we don't have enough toys. Oh, I love that one. Okay. So, um, when you take a look at responses around this age, 3, 4, 5 years old, uh, you tend to see a lot of the same things over and over again. It's like guarantees. Okay, so it'll get broken fast. No, it won't. His feet are glued. Okay, so it's a guarantee. Um, a lot of these are like focused on the benefits. It's like not what are the issues here. It's like no, well, his feet are glued. His feet are glued, so it's okay. That's a benefit. We don't have enough toys. Okay, so we need the toy because it's a benefit for us, so that way we'll get more toys. Okay. So at this younger age, we're getting a lot of those like positive, happy responses. And there's actually gender differences between boys and girls when this was done. So boys were more about reasoning and fair play, and girls were more like asking questions and making statements. So um, boys made fewer requests, but they talked more about fair play. Like, well, it's only fair if we do this. While girls tended to make more requests, but they were through questions and statements. Okay. So, I mean, I think this is going to depend on the culture, of course. This was, again, 1991, so it's been 30 something years, and we may see fewer differences now, but we don't know yet. Okay. So, another study, 1996, did the same thing, um, but they took a look at how children, again, how they did persuasion, but at different sets of ages. So 4 years old, 6 years old, and 8 years old. So there's an idea here that, of course, as you get older, you get better at politeness, you get better at persuasion, you get better at storytelling, all these different things. So what they found was replicated. These younger kids, okay, these 4-year-olds, they're a lot more egocentric. So they're definitely focused more on themselves than others. While um, I should explain this chart. So on the bottom, this is like how you're appealing. Like you're basically saying like I want this. Here's my argument. I'm not going to have a conversation. This is just I want this. This is why. Discourse says I'm going to have a conversation with you and try to understand you and persuade you like over a conversation. Okay. So going back, 4-year-olds are very egocentric. It's about what they want. And it's just a lot of appeals. 6-year-olds are in this transition period, but 8-year-olds now show a different strategy. 8-year-olds are now saying, sometimes I just want something and I'm going to say it. But most of the time, I'm gonna have a conversation with you. I'm gonna persuade you that it's not just about me. It's like a benefit for the whole family. Maybe it has costs, but we can still get this thing. So children around 8 years old, 7 years old, they tend to be a little bit more persuasive and try to understand the adult's perspective and argue with that. So they're thinking about what the adult is thinking and they're trying to counter it rather than just being like self-centered. Okay. So here's two conversations. One with Giovanna and her mother, one with Luca and his mother and her mother. Mom, what beautiful Barbies! I want one. The mother just says, "Come on, let's go." Okay. Mom, look at these Legos. I'd like to have one, but this is too expensive. But it must have all the kinds of Legos. So this is, 6 years old. So we're still at this transition period. And now let's take a look at Angela, 8 years old. Definitely the Angela that you know and love. Okay. No, not really. How much does this one cost? A lot of money, eh? Yeah, this one really costs this much. And this one, that one too. Okay, so in this conversation, we're not seeing a full persuasion strategy, but we do see the tactic. What we see is, okay, this one costs too much. So now the child is going into this negotiation phase where they're saying, well, okay, maybe not this one, but what about that one over there? So trying to negotiate a different toy, a different object, a doll in this case, um, without arguing back and being like self-centered. So there's more negotiation with the adult to try to get something in the end. Okay. So going with this, these are just sample conversations, but there's a lot of different types of ways they might make these requests or might negotiate. So taking a look at the fours, sixes, and eights. So first of all, imperatives, interestingly, tend to peak around 6 years old. So get me that, so on. Advertisements, again, peak around 6 to 8 years old. So they understand that like the parent needs to be convinced it's not self-centered, but maybe at 8 years old you realize this isn't just a great thing. Questions are when they start coming in, and this happens a lot more at 8 years old. So now to begin the negotiation process, you have to ask questions like, can we get this? First of all, that's like politeness coming in. With polite requests we see too, so these are happening. But it's a lot more questions to try to probe where the adult is at to make some persuasive arguments. Um, Attention getters, we don't need to talk about too much. These are self-centered and they happen more at 4 years old than 8 years old. Okay, so what we're seeing here with persuasion is generally as you get older, you're able to negotiate a little bit better. You understand the adult's perspective and so on. So let's go beyond this child age and let's look at teenagers for the first time in this course. Okay, 11-year-old and 15-year-old teenagers. Okay, so what happens at this point? Children are a lot more practiced with status, so they understand language a lot better. They understand the social hierarchy better. So what we get is a class difference. So 11 to 15 years old, you get more imperatives, so more commands to lower status addressees. Okay, so if someone is lower status than you, it's less questions and more commands. And 15-year-olds tend to do it a lot more than 11-year-olds. When they know someone closely, they're making a lot more commands. This goes for both 15 and 11-year-olds. So they know if they know someone very well, they can be a little bit less polite and just make commands. Also, they're teenagers, they're grumpy. And also, 15-year-olds are starting to do more positional appeals. So more manipulation. This isn't persuasion. I mean, it's part of persuasion, but it is manipulation. You're my friend, and if you're my friend, you'll buy one. So they're understanding what social norms are, and they're using social norms in order to get what they want. Okay. And 15-year-olds do this a lot more than 11-year-olds. So I think 15-year-olds are understanding the power of social norms and pressures. They understand people give into it, and some will manipulate more than others. Okay. So going into teenage years, I guess with children, you can say 4 to 6 years old, is they're learning how to use it as a tool, and then teenagers are starting to weaponize it. They're becoming better at persuasion. They're becoming better at negotiation. They're understanding the social rules more, and they're actually able to use some nefarious aspects of language and human behavior to get what they want. Okay, that's persuasion. Two more slides on storytelling. I think storytelling is very like clear once you see some examples. But I'll post a video or two about this too, so you can hear it yourself. You can hear the difference between children. So I just have some samples of stories here, and I think we can extract a lot of information from these. Okay, so these children are looking at a story like a picture book, and they're just trying to tell an adult what's happening in it. Okay, so here's a child at 3 years old. They're looking at it, and there's a frog. He's looking at the jar. This frog's not there, getting out, climbing up the tree, running away, fell off the tree, and the boy's fallen. He falls into the water, and there's frogs. They in the water. Okay, so do you understand what happened here? Maybe, because there's some text here that tells you what's going on. But this is a boy who is climbing a tree and falling into the water. Okay, and then apparently there's a dog here too, and there's a deer as well. So like, no, we actually have no idea what's going on unless you read this text because the child is not doing a good job. What the child is doing in this case is they're describing a lot of actions, and they're also not giving a lot of subjects. They still don't have these reference words right. So it's just a lot of actions, and there's no real coherence there. It's not a story, it's just a sequence of actions, and you have to infer that there's a story there. So at 3 years old, they're just saying what they see. They don't understand that there's a narrative structure yet. Here's a child at 5 years old. Okay, I will read some of this. And this is where I say if you don't like children, this might get a little bit unbearable. But yeah, okay. When the boy and the dog were asleep, the frog jumped out of the jar, and then the boy and the dog woke up. The frog was gone. Then the boy got dressed, and the dog stuck his head in the jar. And then the boy opened his window and called out for his frog. And the dog still had the jar on his head. Then the dog fell, and the boy was scared. And then the boy was mad at the dog and picked him up, and then he called for his frog again. He called in the hole, and the dog called in the beehive. Okay, we see this. We see this in our data analyses that we're doing. And then, and then, and and then you go to the bottom, and the boy, and they splash, and 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 and. Okay, so what's happening around 6 years old? Okay, the coherence of the story is way better. We can actually understand what's happening. There's way more. They're saying way more about the story. They're going through the whole thing, and it's more coherent. Okay, the difference is that younger kids are telling stories still as a sequence of events. These are like when you take a look on posts online and people are writing like one sentence responses to posts. They're just like very simple, very short sentences um that explain what's happening, and also we get a lot of these like and then. So it's like okay, very straightforward storytelling. Not a lot of fancy language here. We're getting the content, it's more coherent, but this is still not like a great story. So we get narrative structure, which is fantastic. The and then, this is a narrative structure. They know this is one big story. They just don't know how to do it yet. And if you think about this child is basically telling you what's on a picture book. And if you think about it, like they're telling the story quite well. So they're taking the picture book, they're turning it all into words, and they're just telling a story. Okay, so around 6 years old, this gets a lot better. 8 years old, 10 years old, you see further development, and depending on how much somebody reads, how much somebody talks, how excited they are. So there's a lot of different emotional changes, mental changes, personal changes that can affect the development of storytelling afterwards. So some people are very good at storytelling, some people are bad at it. Um, you know, Around 8 to 10 years old, everyone gets to the standard level. They get pretty good at it. And then you're going to diverge there based on how interested you are and how practiced you are in storytelling and your personality. Okay, so that's some stuff for parent-child interaction. We did get to see a lot of overlap with pragmatics, especially thinking about the errors that we've seen before and how this all ties in. It's actually pretty interesting. So, um, see, children are still limited by their grammar, so all the stuff we saw before is still true. And then we got to see some negotiation tactics. We get to see how a child's age, how his mental ability is developing over time. So yeah, Next week is bilingualism, and if you want to see videos on these things, they'll be posted on Canvas. Some very good examples of things that we've seen here.